Belladonna Close lay, tucked a little apart from the main village street of St. Mary. The houses there were newer than most in the parish, though they tried with varying degrees of success to imitate the gracious old style. Flowering hedges separated one neat front garden, and in the evenings the lamps gave the little cul-de-sac faintly theatrical air, as though one had stepped onto a stage set. At number 7 lived Mrs. Venetia Fenchurch, a widow of comparatively recent arrival. She had brought a ripple of excitement into the usually placid surface of village life. Venetia was handsome, too handsome, some said, with her elaborately waved dark hair, her bright mouth that smiled just a little too readily, and a wardrobe that would have looked more at home in Bond Street than St. Mary. She had taken the late Colonel Fenchurch's money, so rumor declared, and spent it lavishly upon herself. On that warm June evening, her house was lit for a dinner party. Cars had arrived from the neighboring lane, bringing guests in rustling dresses and polished shoes. There was a murmur of conversation, laughter spilling out of the open French windows onto the terrace, where roses grew in extravagant. Miss Jane Marple, invited somewhat unexpectedly, had accepted with her usual quiet courtesy. She was fond of observing, and Mrs. Fenchurch's dinners promised, at the very least, excellent material for observation. The drawing room into which the guests were ushered was modern in furnishing, but heavy in effect. There were too many drapes, too many cushions, and a faint scent of powder and lilies hung in the air. Mrs. Fenchurch herself presided in a gown of deep rose silk, clasping a glass of champagne as though it were a scepter. "How lovely to see you, dear Miss Marple," she said, with a practiced warmth that just failed to reach her eye. "You must sit near me later and tell me all the village. No one keeps their finger on the pulse of things quite as you do." Miss Marple smiled mildly and allowed herself to be introduced to the other. There was Dr. Leonard Mayhew, the local physician, a spare, slightly sardonic man with a reputation for efficiency and little bedside manner. Beside him, his sister Clara, who wore dowdy clothes but watched everything with bird-like. Colonel and Mrs. Blunt, old military acquaintances of Venetia, completed the group, together with Julian Ashworth, a young man in his late 20s who was said to be something in the city and was frequently seen at Venetia's side of. Dinner was served in good style. A soup, a sole with cucumber sauce, and roast duck with cherry compote. Miss Marple noted the smooth efficiency with which Elise, Mrs. Fenchurch's French, managed the course. Elise was pale, nervous-looking, her dark eyes flitting now and again toward her mistress as though seeking approval. Conversation was bright, if at times zed. Venetia dominated, her laugh ringing across the table. She teased Julian Ashworth about his bachelor, rallied the colonel on his golf, and once or twice made remarks that left poor Clara Mayhew blushing to the roots of her hair. It was during the final course, a rather magnificent trifle, that Mrs. Fenchurch rose to give a little speech. The glasses were filled again, this time with a chilled white wine. Elise moved swiftly around the table, setting each goblet before the guests. Miss Marple observed that Venetia herself reached for her own glass, turning it in her hand so that the light struck through the pale golden. "Let us drink," Venetia declared, "to friendship, to laughter, and to all the pleasures that life in our little Belladonna Close affords us." There was a chorus of polite agreement. Glasses lifted. Miss Marple raised hers, though only sipped. She had always thought wine rather disagreeable, and in any case, she preferred to keep her faculties unclouded. Mrs. Fenchurch lifted her glass high, her painted lips curving into a smile, and then, quite suddenly, her face changed. The smile froze, her eyes widened, and the glass slipped from her hand to shatter upon the floor. She gave a gasp, staggered, and clutched at the edge of the table. A moment later, she crumpled to the carpet in a swirl of rose-colored silk. There was an outcry. Mrs. Blunt screamed. Julian Ashworth leapt to his feet. Dr. Mayhew bent swiftly over the fallen woman, fingers seeking her pulse. "Good heavens!" cried the colonel. "Is it a faint?" The doctor's face was grim. "No, fetch some water, quickly." But even as Elise darted away, it was evident that water would be of no avail. Venetia lay still, her head at an unnatural angle, her lips already paling beneath the smear of crimson lip. Miss Marple remained seated, her blue eyes very calm. She had seen death often enough in her long life, though seldom in such dramatic circumstances. What arrested her attention, oddly, was not the still figure on the floor, nor the frantic exclamations of the others, but a small, commonplace detail. The wineglass that had fallen from Venetia. It lay shattered, the stems snapped, and upon one jagged fragment clung the vivid imprint. The stain was oddly blurred, as though the substance had not adhered quite normally. Miss Marple, leaning slightly forward, noted the way the color had run and fainted. Dr. Mayhew straightened, his voice low. "She's gone." For a moment there was silence, broken only by Mrs. Blunt's muffled sob. Then Julian said hoarsely, But she was laughing a moment ago. She was perfectly well." The doctor shook his head. "Or perhaps, or something else. We must inform the authorities at once." Yes, Colonel Blunt agreed hurriedly. "The police, they must be told." "Poor Venetia," Clara Mayhew whispered. "How dreadful, how utterly dreadful," and dabbed her eyes with a... Elise had returned, a glass of water trembling in her hand, but she set it down with a little cry as she saw her mistress unmoving. She began to sob, incoherent words in French spilling from her lips. Through it all Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting bag clasped in her lap. Outwardly, she appeared merely shocked, an old lady confronted with sudden death. But inwardly her thoughts were already moving with quick precision. People did not, in her experience, collapse mid-toast without reason. Sudden heart attacks were possible, of course. She had known of them often, but there had been something in Venetia's expression, something in the way her hand jerked as she dropped the glass, that spoke of violent surprise. And that lipstick mark? Yes, that was peculiar. Very peculiar indeed. As the household descended into confusion, Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing. Julian pacing distracted, his face pale, Clara's avid gaze fixed on the scene with a strange intensity. The colonel's attempts at briskness, Elise's near hysteria. She registered it all, storing away each impression with the care of one who knew that in such small observation lay the seeds of truth. Presently the local constable arrived, summoned by a gardener who had run for. He blustered about important, sent for Inspector Craddock, and did his best to clear the room. The guests were shepherded into the drawing room, murmuring to one another in shaken tone. Miss Marple sat a little apart, her hands folded. No one paid her much attention. She was only an elderly gentlewoman from the village, after all. That suited her very well, for she was already quite certain that Mrs. Venetia Fenchurch had not died by natural means. The manner of her death might be hidden, but hidden things had a way of becoming clear to those who looked as closely as Marple. And already, on that first night of tragedy in Belladonna Close, she had begun to look why the following morning the news had spread as swiftly as bramble over a hedgerow. Death always made the rounds quickly in St. Mary, but when the death in question was sudden, dramatic, and connected with one of the most talked-about households, and tongues could scarcely move fast. Mrs. Hartnell, leaning on her gate, was already informing Mr. Tompkins the butcher that it had been a seizure, though she added darkly that one never knew with these society women and their going. At the same moment, Mrs. Price Ridley, returning from early service at the church, assured Miss Weatherby that it was undoubtedly poison. After all, had she not herself tasted the trifle, and hadn't it seemed to her rather overflavored? By 10 o'clock, there was not a teacup poured in the village without Venetia Fenchurch's name upon the... At the vicarage, Mrs. Haydock confided earnestly to Griselda Clement that the poor woman had been most frightfully overpainted at the dinner, and no doubt her heart had given out from sheer artificiality. Griselda, with her usual dry humor, remarked that she was not aware rouge could stop the circulation. The vicar, who disliked scandal, attempted to turn the conversation toward the forthcoming church fete, but no one listened. In the midst of all this, Miss Marple moved unobtrusively through her mourning, as she always. She gathered a few blooms from her garden, pale pink roses, her pride, and trimmed them carefully before setting them in glasses. She sorted her knitting basket. She wrote a note of condolence to Mrs. Blunt, who, she knew, had been quite overcome at the... Outwardly, all was peace and routine, but inwardly, Miss Marple was reflecting. She had seen many forms of death, some natural, some man-made. She had listened to much idle chatter in her youth, and knew that gossip, however unreliable, often contained curious fragments. Already, in the chorus of voices that rose through St. Mary, she could detect threads worth pursuing. By late morning, she was seated in the Rose tea shop with her old friend, Mrs. Bantry, who had been only too eager to hear an account of what had passed. "My dear Jane, you must tell me everything," said Mrs. Bantry, leaning forward eagerly. "It's perfectly dreadful. Venetia, of all people, and at her own dinner party. Did she suffer, do you think?" "She did not suffer long," said Miss Marple gently. "And they say," continued Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice despite the fact that half the tea shop was plainly straining to listen, "they say it was the one. That Elise girl poured it out, and Venetia no sooner lifted the glass to her lips than down. The police are certain of it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her blue eyes thoughtful. "I wonder," she murmured. Mrs. Bantry looked at her with sudden alertness. "Now, Jane, that tone of yours. You noticed something, haven't you?" "You always do." Miss Marple smiled in her mild way. "One notices what one can, Dolly. People do not always pay attention to the smallest thing, but it is often the smallest things that matter most." She let the remark rest, for she knew her friend well enough. Mrs. Bantry would chew over it like a dog with a... And in the meantime, Miss Marple could collect her own thoughts undisturbed. Across the shop, Mrs. Price Ridley was telling anyone who would listen that Elise had been seen crying hysterically in the garden and that it was a sure sign of... Mrs. Hartnell countered with the opinion that foreign servants were always unreliable, and it was no more than one might expect. To all this Miss Marple listened without appearing to do so, nodding occasionally, stirring her tea with slow precision. Her eyes, however, were far away. When she returned to her cottage in the afternoon, she found Inspector Craddock waiting. He rose when she entered, his expression a mixture of courtesy and professional impatience. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hoped I might have a word with you. You were present last night at Mrs. Fenchurch's dinner." "Yes, Inspector. A most distressing occasion." He inclined his head. "Indeed. You may be assured the police are treating it with the utmost seriousness. Dr. Mayhew is convinced death was not natural. Poison, administered by way of the maid Elise handled the bottles. The evidence points strongly." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "And what poison does the doctor suppose it was?" Craddock hesitated. "That has not yet been determined, but it acted swiftly. The girl had opportunity, and I gather she has a record of discontent. It will not be difficult to establish." "I see," said Miss Marple softly. The inspector looked at her with faint irritation. He knew that tone. "You do not agree?" "I merely observe," said Miss Marple, "that Mrs. Fenchurch poured her own wine. The glasses were all filled, but she changed hers about before making toast. It struck me at the time as a little curious." Craddock frowned. "Changed it? How so?" She set aside the one placed before her and reached for another near Julian Ashworth's place, if I recall correctly. She seemed particular about it. One cannot say why. The inspector made a note. "That is useful, Miss Marple. Very useful indeed." Miss Marple said no more. She knew better than to press her opinions on the piece. They preferred to think their discoveries their own. Yet her mind was busy, for she was already certain that the maid's arrest, if it came, would be premature. Toward evening she strolled through her garden, pausing among the roses. The air was heavy with their scent, bees droning lazily. She reflected that roses, with their loveliness, thorns, were rather like human beings. Beauty without could conceal danger. She recalled Venetia's face as she had raised her glass, the smile, the vanity, the confidence. She remembered, too, the curious smear of lipstick on the broken fragment, the way it had blurred as though something in it resisted the glass itself. That detail troubled her more than anything else. Miss Marple sighed, bent, and clipped a withered blade. Death, she thought, was never far away, even in a garden full of... And where human beings were concerned, vanity and malice were often the deadliest growths of all. The inquest had not yet been formally scheduled, but already the household at No. 7 Belladonna Close stood under a pall of unease. Curtains were drawn, the French windows shut, and Elise, the maid, flitted about with swollen eyes, her apron constantly twisted between her hands. The neighbors, who had always half envied Venetia's gaiety and half condemned her ostentation, now whispered with mingled pity and curiosity whenever they passed. Miss Marple, outwardly tranquil as always, had been invited by Mrs. Blunt to take tea that afternoon. The colonel's wife, still visibly shaken, required an audience for her distress. Miss Marple obliged, knowing from long practice that such visits could yield more than sympathy. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blunt cried the moment her guest was settled, "I can scarcely sleep for the horror of it all. To think of poor Venetia, so full of life, so beautiful. One can hardly believe she is gone. And so sudden, too. Sudden deaths are always more shocking," said Miss Marple gently. She stirred her tea and regarded the woman with mild eyes. "Had you known Mrs. Fenchurch long?" Mrs. Blunt dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Only since she came to Belladonna Close last. But she made a circle of friends at once. People were drawn to her. My husband admired her spirit greatly, though, if I may say so, I sometimes felt it bordered on, well, extravagance." "Yes, indeed." Miss Marple nodded, as if considering the subject from every angle. "I fancy Mrs. Fenchurch enjoyed her position in society. Such ladies often do." Mrs. Blunt leaned forward. "Do you think it was really poison, Miss Marple? Colonel says the inspector is determined upon that poor maid, Elise. I cannot imagine her doing such a dreadful... Yet who else could have been? That Miss Marple Murder, is precisely what interests me. For Miss Marple's thoughts had been returning again and again to the broken wineglass. She had contrived that morning to step into the garden of number 7 on the pretext of inquiring after peace. There, among the refuse to be collected, she had observed a small paper bag in which the fragments of glass had been placed. It was not her way to interfere directly with official, yet her eyes had alighted at once upon the piece that bore the lipstick smear. That smear had not the natural appearance of rouge or carmine. The color had blurred oddly, not merely rubbed but streaked, as though moisture had interacted. Lipstick, in Miss Marple's knowledge, for she had a younger niece with a fondness for such, did not behave so. Miss Marple had stood very still, gazing down at the fragment, until Elise's sudden appearance had caused her to draw. But the image of that blurred, crimson mark remained sharply imprinted in her. Later that same day, Miss Marple paid a call upon Clara Mayhew. She found the doctor's sister in her usual subdued attire, seated primly in the small parlor, where everything smelled faintly of lavender and dust. "Such a tragedy," Clara said in hushed tones, pouring weak tea into thin cups. "Leonard scarcely spoke a word all morning. He says it was poison, and that the authorities will prove it. And how wicked people can be, Miss Marple. And for what? Venetia had enemies, I suppose. A woman of her type always does." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Enemies? I had not thought of that." Clara's eyes gleamed with repressed satisfaction. "Oh, but surely people envied her looks, her money, her charm. And there were whispers. Yes, indeed. She was fond of attention. Too fond, if you ask me." Miss Marple gave a little sigh. Poor Mrs. Fenchurch. She was certainly admired by Mr. Ashworth. At that, Clara pursed her lips. "Julian Ashworth, a fortune hunter, if ever I saw one. Mark my words, he was after her money. But she was clever. She would never have married. Perhaps he grew tired of waiting." It was not an accusation, exactly, but it lingered in the air as though Clara had hoped her guest would seize upon it. Miss Marple merely nodded with polite vagueness. She had learned long ago that gossip revealed more about the gossiper than the subject. As she walked home through the twilight, her mind turned once more to Elise. The girl's distress seemed genuine, and yet grief and guilt could resemble one another to the untrained eye. What troubled Miss Marple was not so much Elise's emotion as the too-ready eagerness of others to fasten blame upon her. Foreign servants, after all, were convenient scapegoats. That evening, Miss Marple received a caller. Inspector Craddock appeared at her gate, hat in hand, his expression both respectful and slightly. He had learned by now to regard Miss Marple's observations with serious consideration. "I wonder," he said, after she had ushered him into the neat little sitting room, "if you noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Fenchurch's manner last night, before she collapsed?" Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Only that she seemed in the highest of spirits. Perhaps rather too high, if you understand me. It is often the way when people are concealing uneasiness beneath." Craddock gave a grunt. "Uneasiness? You think she was afraid of something? Or someone?" He frowned. "And the glass? You mentioned she changed hers. I've spoken with Ashworth. He swears he never noticed." "That," said Miss Marple quietly, "is exactly what interests me. She took his glass, or one very near his place, in preference to her own, almost as though she wished to make a point of." Craddock sat back. "A point? To whom?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ah, that is what we must discover." When the inspector had gone, Miss Marple remained thoughtful. She had seen, in her long life, many little dramas of vanity and spite. Women, especially, could be cruel to one another where beauty or admiration were concerned. She recalled the faded lipstick mark upon the shard of glass, blurred and running, and felt a chill certainty stir with the poison. She was convinced had not been in the wine at all. It had been the lipstick. Inspector Craddock was a methodical man. He liked matters to proceed in neat, sensible lines, cause and effect, opportunity and motive. Poisonings were messy things, but they could be reduced, in his view, to a clear pattern. And in the case of Mrs. Venetia Fenchurch, the pattern pointed squarely at Elise, the Frenchman. By the morning after the tragedy, Elise was removed from her mistress's house and placed in the care of the constabulary. She protested violently, tears streaking her face, words tumbling out in a torrent of French and broken English. "Non, I swear I never hurt Madame. She was kind to me. Sometimes she scolded, yes, but she was always generous." Her cries echoed down the stone corridor until the cell door closed upon them. In St. Mary Mead, the arrest was greeted with almost smug relief. "Well, of course it was the maid," said Mrs. Harton, pleased to have her suspicions. "Foreigners are never to be trusted. I said so from the beginning." Mrs. Price Ridley agreed. "These girls bring their strange ways. Heaven knows what they put in the food." The village in short, was satisfied. A tragedy, yes, but one with an explanation that fitted. Only Miss Marple, sipping her tea by the vicarage hearth that after, seemed untroubled by any sense of resolution. Griselda Clement, curled in a chair, regarded her with interest. "You don't believe it, do you, Jane? I can tell by your face." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, one must always consider human nature. People seldom act without reason. Now, Elise, she had reason to fear dismissal, perhaps, but not to kill. Her tears are quite genuine. She is frightened, not guilty." The vicar, who had been frowning at his sermon notes, looked up. "But surely the inspector knows best, Miss Marple. The poison was in the wine, and Elise poured the wine. That seems simple enough." "Simple things," Miss Marple replied, "are not always the truest." At that same hour, Inspector Craddock was seated in the drawing-room at number 7 Belladonna Close, his notebook open, his expression determined. Around him sat the remaining guests of the fatal dinner. He had insisted on reassembling, a sort of informal inquiry before the formal inquest. Dr. Leonard Mayhew stood by the mantel, austere and self-assured. Clara sat in a corner, her hands folded tightly. Julian Ashworth lounged, attempting a nonchalance that fooled no one. Colonel Blunt paced, his military mustache bristling. "You all understand," Craddock said, "that this is merely to clarify your statements. Mrs. Fenchurch's death is no longer in doubt. The laboratory report confirms the presence of a toxic alkaloid in the residue from her dress, a swift-acting substance, consistent with digitalis or perhaps something similar. It was not accidental. The poison was administered at the table. There was a stir, though no real surprise. Everyone had, in their hearts, known as much." And Craddock continued, "The only person with opportunity to administer it was the maid Elise. She handled the bottles and the glasses. She admits to pouring out the wine. No one else touched Mrs. Fenchurch's glass." Julian Ashworth gave a little laugh. "Well, there you are then. The girl must have done it." But Miss Marple, who had been permitted to attend on the grounds of her witness status, raised her mild eye. "Pardon me, Inspector, but I cannot quite agree. Mrs. Fenchurch herself changed her glass before drinking. I observed it clearly. She chose one not meant for her." Julian frowned. "Did she? I never noticed." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I dare say not. Young men are often too occupied with themselves to notice such small matters." The inspector interjected briskly. "Nevertheless, the fact remains, the poison was in the glass she drank. Whether she chose it or not, Elise filled them all. The chain of responsibility leads back to her." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perhaps." Dr. Mayhew spoke sharply. "The old woman is right about one thing. Venetia was particular. She always fussed about trifles, the right glass, the right mirror. Vanity, of course. It could be her undoing." There was a note in his voice that Miss Marple did not miss. A faint edge, something not of mere professional observation, but of personal disdain. She stored away quietly. Colonel Blunt stopped pacing. "Confound it all, Craddock. Do you mean say there's no chance some outsider got in? Some prowler? Poison doesn't grow on trees." "On the contrary, Colonel," Miss Marple said softly, "it sometimes does. Belladonna, for instance." Her words fell into silence. The very name of the close seemed to echo them. Clara gave a little shiver. Craddock cleared his throat. "Well, be that as it may, I am satisfied as to the maid's guilt. Unless further evidence appears, Elise will remain in custody. The inquest will return its verdict accordingly." The gathering broke up soon after, each departing with his or her own private. Only Miss Marple lingered, thanking the inspector politely before making her way home. It was a warm evening, and the air smelled of honeysuckle. Yet Miss Marple's heart was troubled. She had seen too much of life to be content with easy. Elise, she was convinced, was innocent. But if the poison had not been in the wine, or not put there by Elise, then how had it been given? She thought again of that blurred lipstick stain. Cosmetics, she knew, could contain strange substances. She had once read in a periodical of powders and creams laced with harmful ingredients, sold cheaply to women who sought glamour without expense. And Venetia Fenchurch had been nothing if not. As she reached her garden gate, Miss Marple paused, her eyes thoughtful. Elise's arrest had brought comfort to the village, but not to her. The true killer, she was certain, still walked free in Belladonna Close. And killers, in her experience, seldom stopped at one crime. Belladonna Close, for all its neat hedges and new-built charm, was not a place entirely east. Beneath the veneer of suburban gentility ran undercurrents of envy, ambition, and discontent. Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that human nature seldom altered from village to village, found the same familiar patterns as in St. Mary. Only the names changed. In the days following Venetia Fenchurch's sudden death, she paid a series of calls. They were not inquisitions, of course. Miss Marple never interrogated. She merely visited, sipped tea, asked mild questions, and listen while people revealed more than they. Her first visit was to Dr. Leonard Mick. His house was a narrow, respectable place, sparsely furnished, with a faint odor of antiseptic. Clara answered the door, leading her into a sitting room where the doctor soon joined them, his manner brisk. "You wish to speak about the unfortunate business, Miss Marple? I can assure you the medical evidence is quite plain. Poison, no doubt about it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And yet you looked troubled the night it happened." The doctor's mouth tightened. "Naturally, it is never agreeable to witness such a thing. But Venetia was always extravagant. She lived too fast, if you take my meaning. She squandered money, health, even affection. A woman like that makes enemies without effort." "Enemies?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked soft. "Oh, there were plenty who resented her. Women jealous of her looks. Men she toyed with. And of course, she was rumored to be in debt. Her late husband left her well provided for, but she spent freely. Ashworth was sniffing about her fortune. I dare say he'd have married her tomorrow if she'd allowed it." At that moment, Clara interjected, her voice sharp. "Leonard, you speak too freely. Miss Marple does not need to hear such." But Miss Marple only smiled gently. "I find it helpful to understand people as they are, my dear." When she left the Mayhews' house, she walked slowly, considering. Dr. Mayhew's distaste for Venetia seemed to go beyond professional disapproval. And Clara, yes, Clara had spoken quickly, almost too quickly, to shield him. Families often betrayed themselves in their eagerness to protect one another. Her next call was upon Julian Ashworth. He had taken temporary lodgings at the inn, the house in Belladonna Close being too full of police activity. She found him smoking restlessly in the parlor, his tie loosened, his expression pale. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, forcing a smile. "Come to question me too? Everyone seems to think I must have had designs on Venetia. Quite unfair, I assure you. I was fond of her." "I'm sure you were," Miss Marple said mild. "But people will talk, and sometimes women like Mrs. Fenchurch encourage such talk, whether they mean to or not." Julian gave a short laugh. "She liked admiration, yes. That was no crime. But she wouldn't have married me. She made that plain enough. Said she valued her freedom too much. Still, I never wished her dead." His hand shook slightly as he lit another cigarette. Miss Marple noted it without comment. Nerves, perhaps, or guilt, or merely fear that suspicion might settle too heavily upon. She rose after a few minutes, murmuring that she would not tire him further. He looked relieved, which in itself told her something. In the following days, she visited others in Close. Mrs. Price Ridley hinted darkly that Venetia had entertained too many gentlemen callers. Mrs. Hartnell declared she had seen Elise purchase bottles at the chemist's, though she could not say of what. Mr. Tompkins the butcher confided that Colonel Blunt had once been in some difficulty over gambling debts, now miraculously settled. Everywhere, Miss Marple heard whispers, accusations, fragments of and everywhere she listened, filing each piece away in the quiet drawers of. One evening she sat with Mrs. Bantry in her cozy drawing room. The lamplight gleamed on the polished furniture, and a little fire crackled despite the summer. Mrs. Bantry was in her element, a tragedy to dissect, a friend to confide in. "It's extraordinary, Jane, simply extraordinary. To think of a woman like Venetia dropping dead in her own house, and the police so sure about them. Do you believe it?" "No," said Miss Marple simply. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eager. "I knew you'd say that. What have you noticed?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Little things, Dolly. That blurred lipstick mark, for one. It has troubled me from the first. And the way Venetia herself chose her glass. Almost as though she were making a point." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "You don't mean she suspected that she knew her life was in danger?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps she wished to show someone. Vanity can lead people into strange action." Mrs. Bantry was silent for a moment, then asked, "If Elise didn't do it, Jane, who did?" "That," Miss Marple said softly, "is what we must discover. But I think, before long, we shall know." For Miss Marple had begun to see a pattern beneath the gossip. Venetia Fenchurch had indeed been vain, extravagant, careless. She had attracted admirers and enemies alike. And somewhere among those who smiled at her table that night had been one who smiled too well. In the shadows of Belladonna Close, death had walked, and Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and her patient knitting, meant to follow its trail. It was on a quiet Thursday morning that Miss Marple, armed with a basket of hollyhocks for the church bazaar, called once more at number 7 Belladonna Close. The blinds were still drawn, though Inspector Craddock had finished his preliminary work, and the place wore the somber hush of a house struck by tragedy. Elise, pale as linen, opened the door, her hands twisting nervously. "Oh, mademoiselle," she whispered, They think I kill her, but I swear, I did nothing. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the girl's arm. I believe you, my dear. May I come in for a moment? The maid hesitated, then nodded, leading the old lady to Venetia's bedroom. It was a room steeped in perfume and color, even with the curtains half drawn, silken cushions, mirrored vanity, dressing gowns draped carelessly across a chair. Miss Marple's shrewd eyes moved from object to object, absorbing the small betrayals of character a room always revealed. On the dressing table stood an array of bottles, pots, and tubes, rouges, powders, lotion, and among them several expensive-looking lipsticks in lacquered cases. Venetia, it seemed, had spared no expense on her vanity. Did Madame use these often? Miss Marple asked quietly. Elise gave a half-sob. Always, she say. A woman is nothing without her face. I clean the glasses after dinner. Always I see the marks of her rouge upon them. Miss Marple nodded. She bent closer to one of the lipsticks, twisting the case delicately. The stub was worn flat, of vivid crimson. She noticed, too, a faint crystalline dust clinging to the rim, as though some substance had been imperfectly mixed into the color. Her eyes sharpened. Tell me, Elise, did Madame ever complain of her cosmetics? Elise frowned. Once she say the new lipstick make her lips burn. I tell her not to use, but she laughed. She say, beauty is pain, is it not? Miss Marple straightened, her face grave. That, then, was the heart of it. Venetia's death had not been a simple matter of wine poured by a careless. The poison had been concealed more artfully, in a form Venetia herself would place upon her lips. It was vanity that had delivered the fatal dose. She asked Elise a few more gentle questions, then departed, thanking the girl kindly. As she walked home along the sunlit lane, her thoughts turned swift. Lipstick, yes. A clever method, for who would suspect? A smear upon the glass, a lick of color upon the lips, and the deed was done. The blurred stain she had seen upon the broken goblet now stood exposed. But who had tampered with the lipstick? That was the question. That afternoon, she visited Mrs. Bann, ostensibly to discuss arrangements. As they sorted through a box of lens, Miss Marple remarked, "You know, Dolly, people reveal themselves in mirrors more than in..." Mrs. Fenchurch's mirror tells us she valued her face above else. Someone must have known that. Mrs. Bantry gave her a quick look. Do you mean the poison was in her makeup? Miss Marple only smiled. One must not run ahead of the evidence, my dear, but it is a possibility worth keeping in mind. Later that day, Miss Marple took tea with Clara Mayhew, whose sharp features seemed even sharper under the strain of events. Clara spoke bitterly of Venetia's extravagance, always flaunting her beauty, always laughing at those of us who could not compete. She ruined more lives than you would believe. Miss Marple: oh, she was charming, yes, but charming like a serpent. Did she ever confide in you? Asked Miss Marple mildly. Clara shook her head. Venetia confided in no one. She kept her secrets, her little tricks of youth, her powders, and I dare say she would rather die than appear plain. Miss Marple noted the words carefully. Rather die. An interesting choice of phrase. When she returned home, Inspector Craddock was waiting once again. He was not pleased to find her so composed. You've been about again, Miss Marple, he said, accusing, asking questions. I must remind you this is a police matter. Oh, indeed, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. But sometimes the police overlook the smaller domestics. Women's habits, for instance. A gentleman cannot be expected to notice. Craddock frowned, such as. Miss Marple's expression was demure. Lipstick inspector. Did you happen to examine Mrs. Fenchurch's personal effects? The inspector blinked. Lipstick? What on earth? But Miss Marple merely shook her head. Perhaps I am fanciful, but it seemed to me that the lipstick mark upon her glass most peculiar, almost blurred, as though affected by something other than ordinary. Craddock made a note reluctantly. You think the poison might have been in the lipstick itself? I only observe, said Miss, that Mrs. Fenchurch was a woman of vanity, and vanity can sometimes be fatal. The inspector grunted. Well, I'll have the stuff analyzed, but I don't see how it alters the case against the maid. She could have tampered with it as easily as anyone. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes mild. Perhaps, but Elise admired her mistress. Admiration rarely seeks to destroy. Jealousy, on the other hand, or resentment, that is another matter. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden, the twilight soft upon holly. She knitted steadily, her thoughts weaving themselves into a pattern. Venetia had been poisoned by her own vanity. That much she was sure. But among those who had dined with, who had moved freely through her rooms, who had observed her habits, there must be one who had seen the opportunity and seized the mirror, the lipstick, the lie. Those three, she thought, would lead her to the truth. Inspector Craddock was nothing if not decisive. He prided himself on moving firmly once the weight of evidence pointed in a single direction. And now, with the laboratory confirming traces of poison not only in the wineglass, but in one of Venetia Fenchurch's lipsticks, his suspicions solidified rather than access, opportunity, and motive, he declared at the station, his notes spread out before him. Elise had all three. She handled the cosmetics. She prepared the table. She lived under her mistress's, and for what the neighbors say, she had cause enough to hate Venetia Fenchurch. Thus, on Friday morning, Elise was charged formally with murder. The poor girl's protestations echoed through the corridor. Non. I love her, she was kind. I never. But her cries met the unyielding silence of officialdom. In St. Mary Mead, the news was received with satisfaction. The villagers were not unkind, but they were human, and nothing pleased human beings so much as a tidy explanation. Well, it's a relief to have it settled, said Mrs. Harton, buttering her scone. I always said that maid looked sly. Quite right, said Mrs. Price Ridley. 4 and 2. They bring their strange ways. We're safer without her. Only Miss Marple, sitting demurely in her garden with her knitting, did not echo the... Her needles clicked steadily, her lips pursed in thought. Later that day, she walked down to the high street, where she encountered Dolly Bantry bustling out of the grocery. My dear Jane, cried Mrs. Bantry, her eyes sparkling with excitement. It's all settled. Elise is the culprit. Poison in the lipstick, can you imagine? How perfectly extraordinary. And Craddock so triumphant. But you don't look convinced, Jane. You never do. Miss Marple gave her mild smile. Things are seldom so simple, Dolly. I do not like to see conclusions drawn too quickly. The lipstick was tampered with, but Elise, poor child, had no reason to do so. Her mistress was vain, perhaps unkind, but Elise was devoted in her. No, it was someone who envied, or who resented, or who feared Venetia Fenchurch who contrived her. Mrs. Bantry's eyes danced with curiosity. And who, Jane, do you suspect? Miss Marple shook her head. It is too soon to say, but I do know this. If the wrong person is charged, the right one will grow careless. And then, perhaps, we shall see their hand again. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another quiet call at number 7. The house, though under police seal, allowed her entry under Inspector Craddock's grudging indulgence. She moved slowly through the silent room, pausing at the dressing table where Venetia's mirror still stood, reflecting emptiness. Her gaze lingered on the lipstick tubes, now neatly arranged by some official hand. She touched one case lightly. Yes, too neat, too deliberate. The killer, she felt sure, had not relied on chance. It was not Elise's clumsy doing, but a calculated act. On her way out, she encountered Julian Ashworth loitering by the gate. He was pale, restless, his hands twitching at his pockets. Terrible business, he muttered. I can hardly believe it. Venetia gone, and now Elise in custody. Do you suppose she'll hang? Miss Marple's eyes regarded him quietly. I hope not, Mr. Ashworth. An innocent person should not suffer for another's crime. He gave a quick laugh. Too quick. Innocent? Do you mean to say you think she isn't guilty? I think, said Miss Marple soft, that guilt often lies not where it is easiest to place, but where it is hardest to see. He frowned, muttered something unintelligible, and walked away quickly. Miss Marple, watching his retreating back, reflected that nerves showed themselves in curious ways. The following evening, Clara Mayhew visited Miss Marple. She was pale, agitated, her hands clutching her handbag as though for support. I don't know why I've come, she said abruptly, but I had to speak to someone. I can't bear the thought of that girl, Elise, being hanged for something she didn't. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. You are convinced of her innocence? Clara nodded fiercely. Yes. I can't explain why, but I feel it. Leonard says she's guilty, that the evidence is overwhelming, but I don't believe it. Venetia had many enemies. She was cruel, Miss Marple, cruel in ways people don't always see. Miss Marple leaned forward, her needles still. Cruel in what way, my dear? Clara hesitated, then whispered. She humiliated Leonard, laughed at him, belittled him in public. She had no respect for him as a man, as a doctor. He hated her for it. Oh, he pretended indifference, but I saw the anger in him. She broke off, trembling. Oh, I shouldn't have said it. Please don't repeat it. But it wasn't Elise. It wasn't. Miss Marple laid her hand gently over Clara's. Do not distress yourself. Truth has a way of making itself known. However, people try to conceal it. When Clara had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly in her little parlor, the clock ticking. She was thinking hard. The wrong person had been arrested, of that she was sure. And if Clara's words were true, there was more bitterness, more motive than the inspector suspected. But Miss Marple also knew something else. A murderer who believes himself safe is a dangerous creature. He will strike again if pressed, and she must be ready when he... Life in Belladonna Close, though outwardly tranquil, had been far from innocent even before Venetia Fenchurch's death. That much was becoming clearer to Miss Marple with every visit, every whispered word overheard at the greengrocer's or murmured in the pews on Sunday. In her long experience, the present was never detached from the past. To understand the crime, one must look backward and uncover what people most wish forgotten. It began with Colonel Blunt. Miss Marple encountered him outside the tobacconist's, fumbling with his pipe. He looked harassed, the military stiffness of his bearing undermined by a nervous twitch of the jaw. "Dreadful business, Miss Marple," he said, puffing at the unlit pipe. "Quite dreadful. But at least Craddock has the culprit in custody. Can't have this sort of thing hanging about." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "and yet one wonders whether matters are quite so simple. People seldom kill without a powerful reason, you know. Did Mrs. Fenchurch have many enemies, do you suppose?" The colonel avoided her gaze. "Enemies? Nonsense. She was a charming woman, a gracious hostess. Of course, there's always a bit of envy, women and their jealousies, but nothing more serious." Miss Marple's eyes rested upon him gently. "I was told, Colonel, that you had some financial difficulties last. Happily resolved now, I believe." He started, reddened, and muttered, "Rumor, Miss Marple. Idle rumor. Every man has his reverses, but I assure you, nothing serious. Venetia was a friend. She lent a hand once or twice, out of kindness. No more than that. But his agitation was plain, and Miss Marple reflected that money was as common a motive for crime as jealousy, perhaps more so. Her next inquiry led her to the Mayhew. Leonard Mayhew received her with brusque courtesy, but Clara's nervous fluttering betrayed that her brother was not wholly. "Miss Marple," Leonard said, "this business has gone far enough. I dislike speculation. Poisoning is a nasty, sordid method, but it is the maid who had the means and opportunity. That should end it." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, knitting serenely. "And yet, dear doctor, one cannot ignore character. Ellie strikes me as fearful, but not wicked. Whereas Mrs. Fenchurch, well, she was a lady who inspired strong admiration in some, dislike in others." Mayhew's mouth hardened. "Dislike, perhaps. She was frivolous, vain, wasteful. Hardly the sort of woman one respects." Clara interrupted hastily. "Leonard, you shouldn't speak so. Venetia is dead." But her eyes betrayed her. She too had loathed Venetia, though perhaps for different reasons. Miss Marple noted the exchange carefully. Later, over tea with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple reflected aloud. "There is a curious bitterness in Dr. Mayhew. A man slighted, perhaps, and Clara too. Envy often festers quietly in such. One cannot dismiss it." Mrs. Bantry, eyes sparkling with interest, leaned closer. "And what of Julian Ashworth? Surely he had his reasons as—" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, I have made some inquiries. Mr. Ashworth has been less successful in the city than he would have people believe. He invested unwisely, it seems. His attentions to Venetia were not merely admiration, they were necessity. A wealthy widow would have solved many difficulties." Mrs. Bantry pursed her lips, and if she refused him, he might have grown desperate. Precisely. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, the cat dozing on the hearth, and turned the threads over in her mind. Venetia Fenchurch had been beautiful, yes, but beauty such as hers was often a weapon as well as a... She had humiliated Dr. Mayhew, perhaps toyed with Julian Ashworth, perhaps lent money to Colonel Blunt. Each of them had reason to wish her silent. The next day brought another revelation. Miss Marple received a visit from young Mrs. Haydock, the doctor's wife. Her cheeks were flushed, her manner urgent. "Miss Marple, I shouldn't say a word, but, well, one can't help knowing things, small. Did you know that Venetia Fenchurch's late husband left debts behind him?" She pretended otherwise, of course, but the estate was strained. She managed, somehow, to keep up appearances, but it was all appearances. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Debts, you say? That is most interesting." "Yes, and there was talk of blackmail. She had a letter once. I saw it by accident at the post office in a bold hand. She was white as chalk when she read it. She tore it up quickly, but I saw enough to know she was being threatened." The younger woman bit her lip. "I dare say I shouldn't repeat such things, but it seems to me Venetia's life wasn't so enviable as it looked." When Mrs. Haydock had gone, Miss Marple sat very still, her needles resting in her lap. A pattern was emerging. Behind the facade of glamour, Venetia had been cornered, debts pressing, men disappointed, women jealous, perhaps even blackmail. It was a dangerous tangle, and one thread of it had strangled her life. That evening, Inspector Craddock called. He was brisk, confident, satisfied with Elise's arrest. "I thought you should know, Miss Marple," he said, "that the inquest is set for next. The evidence is sound. The lipstick was tampered with. Elise had full access to. There is little doubt." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I do not doubt the evidence, Inspector. Only the conclusion. Elise had access, yes, but so did others. Guests move freely in a hostess's room, especially when vanity tables and mirrors are so inviting. Women, in particular, know the temptations of such." Craddock sighed. "You'll never be content until you've spun your own theory, Miss Marple. But I warn you, I don't encourage interference." "Interference?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Why, Inspector, I would never dream of it. I merely sit in my garden, knit. One sees so much from a quiet corner, if one knows what to look for." When he had gone, she resumed her knitting. She was thinking of Venetia's mirror, and of how reflections often revealed more than the face itself. A woman like Venetia lived on admiration. She would never willingly appear without her armor of rouge powder. Someone who knew her habits intimately, had devised the cleverest of traps. And as Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, she knew one thing with certainty. The histories of Belladonna Close were not yet fully told. Somewhere in those histories lay the final key. It was Sunday evening, the bells of St. Mary Mead having only just ceased their cheerful pealing, when the second calamity struck Belladonna Close. Miss Marple had returned from evensong, her hymn book tucked under her arm, when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Clara Mayhew, pale and trembling, clutching her shawl about her shoulder. "Oh, Miss Marple," she gasped. "It's Leonard. Something dreadful has happened. Please, will you come at once?" Without hesitation, Miss Marple accompanied her down the lane to Mayhew's. The door stood ajar, and within she found Dr. Mayhew stretched upon the drawing-room carpet, his face ghastly pale. A tumbler lay overturned beside him, the liquid staining the rug. "Fetch water!" cried Clara, wringing her hand. But Miss Marple was already kneeling, her calm fingers at the doctor's wrist. She felt the flutter of a pulse, weak, irregular, but still present. His breathing came in shallow gasps. "Call for help," Miss Marple said briskly, "and do not allow anyone to move that glass." Within minutes, neighbors arrived, the vicar among them. The local chemist was summoned, and Leonard Mayhew, by prompt intervention, was revived. But the evidence of the half-emptied tumbler, its bitter odor unmistakable, left no doubt. He had been poisoned, or had attempted poison himself. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, the little house was buzzing with speculation. Clara hovered distraught, insisting her brother had enemies, that someone had tampered with. Leonard himself, recovering upon the sofa, muttered hoarsely that he had mixed a draught for his indigestion. Something wrong in the bottle. Must have been an accident. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner, thought otherwise. Too many accidents, she reflected, were merely attempts in disguise. Craddock questioned Leonard sharply. "What precisely did you take, doctor?" "Bicarbonate," Leonard said weakly, "from the medicine cupboard." "Good heavens, man, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," Craddock replied grimly, "that someone tampered with your supply. And given that your house has been under no scrutiny, that someone must have had access here quite recently." All eyes turned to Clara, who shrank back in horror. No, I would never," Miss Marple interposed gently. "I think it would be unwise to leap to conclusion. Dr. Mayhew is a man of science. It is possible, is it not, that the attack upon him was meant to silence him? Perhaps he knew something, or guessed something, about Mrs. Fenchurch's death." There was a silence. Leonard himself frowned, struggling to sit upright. "I knew nothing, only that Venetia was foolish and vain. I spoke the truth about that, but I accused no one." Clara clutched at his arm. "Leonard, please, don't say any more." Miss Marple watched her with quiet intensity. Fear, she thought, fear of exposure. But whose exposure? Her brother's, or her own? Later, when the house had quieted, Miss Marple walked home with Inspector Craddock. The evening air was cool, scented faintly with wood smoke. "This alters matters," Craddock said. "If someone tried to kill Mayhew, then Elise can't be the only suspect. She's in custody. She couldn't have done it." "Exactly," said Miss Marple softly. Craddock gave her a sidelong look. "You think this proves Elise's innocence?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that innocence proves itself if one is patient. And guilt, too." He grunted. "So, you have someone in mind?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly in the lamp. "Oh yes, Inspector, several someones. Motives are like roses. They grow thickly, and the thorns are many. But one thorn in particular will prick us soon." That night Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. Her thoughts turned over the pattern now forming. 2 attempts, one successful, one failed. Venetia had died by poison cunningly concealed in her lip. Leonard Mayhew had nearly died from a poison draught. The connection was not obvious, yet to Miss Marple it was plain. Someone, somewhere, feared discovery. The following morning she visited Mrs. Bantry, who was practically quivering with excitement. "My dear Jane, the whole village is in an uproar. First Venetia, now Leonard. Who'll be next, I wonder?" Miss Marple said gravely. "That is exactly the question. Who'll be next? Because I'm quite sure the matter is not ended. Murderers, once begun, are rarely content with one crime, especially when their first success brings danger of exposure." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "And who do you think it is?" Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "It is not Elise. Of that I am certain. And it is not an outsider. No, the hand that struck at Venetia and Leonard is a hand very close. A hand that knows habits, fears, and secrets. A hand skilled in disguising. But Jane, if you know, why don't you tell Craddock?" "Because," said Miss Marple softly, "I must be sure. And when I am, there must be no possible doubt. Murderers, Dolly, are clever creatures. But sometimes with the right little trap, they betray themselves." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "A trap, Jane? Are you going to set one?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In due course. For the present, we must wait. The murderer has shown his hand twice. He will show it again. And this time, we shall be ready." As she left the Bantry house, Miss Marple glanced down Belladonna Close, its neat houses drowsing in the afternoon sun. Shadows lay long upon the pavement. Somewhere among those shadows, she thought, lurked a mind as cold and deadly as the plant for which the clothes were. And she, an old woman with her knitting and her garden, meant to uncover. There are many weapons in the world: revolvers, knives, ropes, poison. But Miss Marple, who had seen much and forgotten nothing, always maintained that the deadliest of all was not the cup itself, of course, but the ceremony surrounding, the pause, the quiet, the comforting ritual that drew words out of people unawares. It was with this in mind that she made her way to the vicarage on Monday afternoon, a small basket of shortbread biscuits on her arm. Griselda Clement received her warmly, ushering her into the parlor where the vicar was struggling with a sheaf of parish paper. "My dear Jane," Griselda said cheerfully, "you've come just in time. I was about to pour out. Sit down. We must all fortify ourselves in these dreadful days." Tea was served, the cups tinkling, the biscuits distributed. Miss Marple settled herself, knitting in her lap, and listened while Griselda discussed the parish fate and the new curate's lamentable lack of punctuality. Only when the vicar left to answer a call did Miss Marple remark quietly, "A most distressing business about Dr. Mayhew. Do you think it was truly an accident?" Griselda frowned. "Accident? Hardly. Leonard Mayhew is much too careful." "No, Jane, someone tampered with his drink, just as surely as someone tampered with Venetia. And the thing is, who would want to both go? That's what puzzles me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes, my dear, the second attempt is not meant to kill, but to silence. Perhaps the doctor knew, or guessed, something the murderer feared." Griselda's eyes widened. "Jane, you make it sound like a novel." "Life," said Miss Marple, "is very often like a novel. Only people don't notice the plot." Her next tea visit was to Mrs. Blunt. The colonel's wife looked wan, her eyes shadowed. She poured the tea with trembling hands, spilling a few drops on the saucer. "I can't bear it, Miss Marple," she whispered. "To think of dear Venetia, and now poor Leonard. What is happening to us in Belladonna Close? It feels like a curse." Miss Marple stirred her cup gently. "Curses are only people's way of explaining what they do not wish to face. Tell me, my dear, did Mrs. Fenchurch ever confide in you about her?" Mrs. Blunt hesitated, then said, "She was kind. She lent us money once." The colonel, well, he had been unfortunate at cards. Venetia insisted it was nothing, but I fear he never forgave himself. He is a proud man. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Money again. Always money. After leaving Mrs. Blunt, she walked a little way down the lane and encountered Julian Ashworth. He looked harried, his tie loose, his hair untidy. "Miss Marple," he said with forced brightness, "still knitting away at your mysteries?" She smiled mildly. "I knit because it is useful. One never knows when one may need a length of string. And as one knits one thing. Tell me, Mr. Ashworth, were you in love with Mrs. Fenchurch?" He laughed too loud. "In love? She amused me, that's all. Of course, I admired her. Who didn't? But marriage? Good heavens, no. I couldn't have borne it. She was a woman who devoured everything around her." "But you visited her often," Miss Marple persisted softly. His face hardened. "Naturally, she invited me. And perhaps I hoped, well, I won't deny I could have used her money. Things have been difficult in the city. But I'm no murderer, Miss Marple. Surely you don't think." "I think," she said gently, "that people are often not what they seem. It is best, perhaps, to leave the inspector to his conclusion. I merely knit. His expression was troubled as he walked away. Miss Marple watched him, reflecting that men who lied often did so too emphatically. Her final tea of the week was at the Mayhews' house. Clara received her nervously, her hands fluttering over the teacups. Leonard, still pale, reclined in an armchair. I must thank you, Miss Marple, he said grudgingly. It was your promptness that saved me. The police, however, seemed determined to believe I attempted suicide. Absurd. Clara gasped. Leonard, how could they think such a thing? It is their way, Leonard said bitterly. They prefer the obvious answer. A man with grievances, perhaps despairing. Why not end it all? But I'm not a coward. I was poisoned, deliberately. Miss Marple sipped her tea, perhaps by someone who feared what you might say. Did you, doctor, know anything of Mrs. Fenchurch's affairs that might have been inconvenient? He stiffened. I knew nothing beyond her vanity. She wasted my time, that's all. She wanted compliments instead of diagnoses. I despised her, yes, but I had no wish to kill her. Clara broke in, her voice trembling. You must believe him, Miss Marple. Leonard is a proud man, but he is good. He would never do such a dreadful thing. Venetia had many who disliked her, but Leonard is innocent. Miss Marple looked at her closely. Clara's devotion was real, but so too was her fear. Fear of scandal, fear of exposure, or fear of something more deadly. She set down her cup. I believe, my dear, that the truth will come very soon. Murder cannot be hidden forever. It leaves traces, just as lipstick leaves its mark upon a glass. When she returned home, Miss Marple sat in her little parlor, her needles clicking steadily. Tea had been served, and truth had been spoken. Half-truths, evasions, slips of the tongue. She now had enough threads to see the pattern clearly. Julian's desperation, the Blount's debts, Leonard's bitterness, Clara's jealousy, all were motives. But only one connected cleanly with, only one possessed both the opportunity and the intimate knowledge of Venetia's habit. Miss Marple smiled to herself. A trap will be necessary now. A quiet little trap, woven of tea and conversation, and the guilty hand would reveal itself fast. In every case Miss Marple had ever known, vanity had played its part, sometimes small, sometimes fatal. She remembered a young girl in St. Mary Mead who lied about her age to seem more desirable, and ended by entangling herself in an unhappy. She remembered a farmer who polished his boots each Sunday, not out of cleanliness, but because he wished the world to think him better off. And now Venetia Fenchurch, beautiful, glittering, careless, and dead. It was vanity that had killed her, Miss Marple thought. Not merely her own, but someone else's willingness to exploit it. That Monday evening, she sat before her fire with her knit. Outside, the summer air was heavy with the scent of honeysuckle, but her thoughts were sharp and cool. She reviewed, stitch by stitch, what she had learned. Julian Ashworth had the strongest financial motive, a failing career in the city, debts to clear, and an admiration that had soured when Venetia refused. Colonel Blount had been humiliated by debt as well, though Venetia's generosity had concealed it. Dr. Mayhew had nursed resentment, while Clara's jealousy was naked each time her lips tightened at Venetia's neck. Yet motive alone did not solve the puzzle. The method was key. Who, among them, would think to tamper with a woman's lips? Who would know she always repainted her mouth before making a toast? Miss Marple set down her knitting. The answer was clear. Not a man, for men, in general, seldom noticed such intimate habit. Not Colonel Blount, who thought only of his gall. Not Julian Ashworth, whose knowledge of cosmetics likely began and ended with red lips. And not Leonard Mayhew, whose disdain for his patient's vanity blinded him. No, it was a woman's hand. A woman who had watched Venetia carefully, with the keen, resentful eyes of one who both despised Clara Mayhew. Miss Marple thought back to their conversation over tea. She ruined more lives than you would believe. She would rather die than appear plain. Clara had spoken with passion, almost with relish. And it was Clara who had access freely in Venetia's bedroom. As Leonard's sister, as a companion in village calls, she could slip in unnoticed. The more Miss Marple considered, the more the pattern tightened. Clara, jealous and repressed, had poisoned the lips, and when her brother nearly guessed the truth, when he remarked bitterly on Venetia's vanity, perhaps too openly, Clara had struck again, slipping poison into his draught to silence. Miss Marple sighed. Poor Clara. A lifetime of envy, of bitterness, of watching other women admired while she sat in shadows. Vanity was not only Venetia's weakness. It was Clara's too. Vanity of another kind. The vanity of self-righteousness, of believing oneself better and being unable to bear the proof otherwise. But she must be sure. Clara would not confess easily. And Inspector Craddock, for all his solid common sense, would never accept the word of an old lady who knits unless she laid the matter A trap was needed, a simple, domestic trap, of the sort that no one would suspect until too late. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the Mayhews' house with a small basket of. Clara received her, eyes ringed with fatigue. "How is your brother today?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Resting," Clara replied. "Still weak, but better. It was such a shock." "Yes, poison is always a shock, and so subtle. One never knows where it may have been. In a glass or in a mirror." Clara's eyes flickered. "A mirror." Miss Marple smiled. "Women know their mirrors, don't they? One sees oneself there, as one wishes to be seen." Poor Mrs. Fenchurch depended on hers. She would never appear at her own table without the armor of her lips. Clara's hands twisted. She was vain, disgustingly vain. All those paints and powders, a mockery of true character. Miss Marple leaned forward. "And yet, my dear, it was clever, so very clever, to use that vanity, to poison the one thing she prized. A stroke of genius, almost." Clara's face blanched. She stammered. "What do you mean? I don't understand." But Miss Marple only patted her hand, her expression mild. "One understands more than one admits, Clara. One always does." That evening, Miss Marple wrote a quiet note to Inspector Craddock, requesting that he attend a small gathering at her cottage following. She asked that the principal persons concerned, the Blounts, Julian Ashworth, and the Mayhews, be present. "A little tea," she wrote, "may be of service." When she sealed the envelope, her hands were steady, for she knew that the final act of the little drama in Belladonna Close was about to be played. Miss Marple's cottage was a haven of gentility. The curtains were lace, the furniture chintz, and the tea service a delicate Worcester pattern that had survived 2 wars, countless visitors. It was precisely this air of homeliness, the certainty that nothing dramatic could possibly happen, that made it the perfect stage for a confrontation. On Tuesday afternoon, the guests arrived one by one, summoned by Miss Marple's neat little note. Colonel and Mrs. Blunt came first, the Colonel grumbling about wasted time, while his wife looked pale, uneasy. Julian Ashworth followed, smartly dressed, but with restless eyes. At last came Clara Mayhew, supporting her brother Leonard, who still looked wan, but insisted on attending. Inspector Craddock arrived soon after, notebook in hand, though he gave Miss Marple a look that suggested he thought the exercise unnecessary. "Please do sit down, everyone," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "I thought it would be nice to have a little gathering. After so much distress, it is good to share a cup of tea. And sometimes," she added, her blue eyes very innocent, "the truth comes out more easily over tea than in any police station." There was a murmur of polite assent. The guests arranged themselves in the small parlor, where the roses in the vase filled the room with fragrance. Miss Marple poured out tea, offered cake, and chatted of ordinary things, fate, the weather, the vicar's new curate. She seemed nothing more than a kindly old lady, intent on soothing frayed nerves. But beneath the surface, tension ran like a taut. Craddock watched with impatience, Colonel Blunt with irritation, Julian with suspicion. Clara sat rigid, her hands clasped, her eyes flickering nervously. At last, when cups were nearly empty, Miss Marple set down the teapot and said softly, "We are here because of Mrs. Fenchurch. A beautiful woman, admired, envied, and now dead. Her death was not natural. She was poisoned." There was a stir, though no one contradicted. "The police believe Elise, the maid, guilty," Miss Marple but Elise is innocent. The poison was not in the wine. It was in the lipstick. I saw the mark upon her glass, blurred, distorted. Lipstick does not behave so unless tampered with. Julian gave a short, nervous laugh. "Really, Miss Marple, are you suggesting—" She turned to him gently. "Not you, Mr. Ashworth. You admired Mrs. Fenchurch, but you would never have known how to tamper with her cosmetics. Nor you, Colonel. You thought only of it. No, it was someone who understood vanity. A woman who envied beauty and despised it. A woman who knew Venetia's habits, how she always reapplied her lipstick before raising her glass." Her eyes moved slowly to Clara Mayhew. Clara gave a sharp cry. "No, you're wrong. I never touched." But Miss Marple's voice flowed on, quiet, inexorable. "It was you, my dear. You loathed her, didn't you? You saw how she laughed at your brother, how she outshone you every gathering. You watched her powder her face, paint her lips, while you sat in the shadows. You thought, better she be gone, better her beauty be silent, and so you tampered with her lips. A clever method, no one would suspect." Clara's face had gone chalk white. She trembled violently. "You have no proof." "None." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is why I asked you here. You see, I brought out my own mirror." She lifted a small silver-framed mirror from the table. "A woman glances at her reflection without thinking. It is instinct. And when you arrived, Clara, you looked at yourself here, just as I knew you would. And you touched your lips, not in vanity, but in fear. Fear that some trace might still betray you." Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "Is this true? Did you tamper with the lipstick? Clara gave a strangled laugh. No, it was Leonard. He hated her. He said so himself. But Leonard spoke, his voice hoarse yet steady. Clara, stop. Stop lying. She turned to him in shock. Leonard. His face was gray with despair. I suspected, even before Miss Marple spoke. You fussed over Venetia's things. Too much. You hated her. I knew it, though I tried to ignore it. And when I nearly spoke too plainly, you poisoned me too, didn't you? To keep me silent. Clara shrieked. No, I meant only to frighten, to make you hold your tongue. Her words faltered under the weight of her own confession. Miss Marple folded her hand. It was jealousy, my dear. Nothing more complicated. Venetia's beauty mocked you each day, and your love for your brother curdled into bitterness when she laughed at you. You wanted her gone, and so you used the one thing she prized most, her vanity, to destroy her. Clara collapsed into a chair, her head in her hand. She deserved it, she whispered. She ruined everything. Our peace, our pride, our very lives. She thought herself a goddess, but I showed her she was mortal. There was a silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. At last Inspector Craddock rose, his face grim. I'm afraid you'll have to come with me, Miss Mayhew. You've said enough. Clara lifted her head, her eyes wild. I don't care. Let them hang me. At least she's gone, with all her painted face and her laugh. Mrs. Blunt began to sob quietly. Julian muttered a prayer. Leonard sat with his eyes closed, pain etched upon his features. Miss Marple, pouring the last of the tea, said soft, Vanity, my dear inspector, takes many. Venetia's was to adorn herself with paints and powders. Clara's was to believe herself righteous, superior. Both, in the end, proved fatal. Inspector Craddock, though not easily impressed, had to admit that Miss Marple's drawing room possessed the precise drama of courtship. The chintz armchairs, the ticking clock, the polished teapot, all deceptively ordinary. Yet in that ordinariness the guilty heart had been laid bare. After Clara Mayhew's outburst, the little gathering sat stunned. Colonel Blunt cleared his throat noisily, as though wishing to disperse the atmosphere, while Mrs. Blunt wept quietly into her handkerchief. Julian Ashworth paced the rug, muttering. Leonard Mayhew sat rigid, his hands clenched upon his knees, his eyes fixed on his sister with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Craddock at last spoke, brisk and professional. I'll need a full statement, of course. But before we remove Miss Mayhew, I think it best we hear the matter plainly. Miss Marple, you've had your suspicions for some time. Would you care to tell us how you arrived at them? All eyes turned to the elderly lady, and she looked serene, almost apologetic, as though reluctant to intrude upon events. Yet her voice, when she spoke, carried clearly through the little room. It is very simple, Inspector. Mrs. Fenchurch was poisoned not by what she ate or drank, but by what she wore. The lipstick upon her glass was blurred, streaked in a way I had never seen before. And I have had some experience of lipstick. My young nieces have been fond of it. Lipstick does not run unless something within it causes it. I thought at once of poison. Julian stopped pacing. But how could you be sure? Anyone might have tampered with it. Miss Marple shook her head. Not anyone. Only someone who understood her habits. Venetia Fenchurch was vain. She always repainted her mouth before raising us. I watched her do so that night. She even exchanged her glass, quite deliberately, I think, as if to show off her perfectly pips. That was her downfall, and only another woman, resentful and observant, would have known her routine so well. Clara stirred, her face pale. You can't know that, she whispered. I can, Miss Marple said gently, for I watched you, my dear, in little. When you visited me, you spoke with passion of her vanity. She would rather die than appear plain, you said. That was not a casual remark. It was the thought of someone who had brooded long upon them. And when I mentioned mirrors, you could not hide your fear. You touched your lips without knowing it, not in pride, but in guilt. Craddock nodded slowly. And the second attempt? On your brother? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked soft. That confirmed it. Leonard Mayhew disliked Venetia, but he would never have chosen poison as his weapon. He is too proud, too blunt a man. Clara feared he had guessed the truth. He spoke too bitterly of Venetia's vanity, perhaps revealing more than she liked. So she slipped poison into his draught, not to kill, but to silence. To make him ill, confused, uncertain. But poison is treacherous, and she nearly succeeded too well. Leonard gave a groan, covering his face with his hand. Clara, what have you done? His sister's lips moved soundlessly. Then, in a sudden rush, she cried, She ruined you. She laughed at you, humiliated you before others. I could not bear it. To see her beauty, her arrogance, her mocking smile. She had everything, and I had nothing. I only meant to stop her laughter. Miss Marple regarded her with sorrow. But, my dear, murder does not silence laughter. It only leaves sorrow in its place. You let envy eat away at you until it drove you to this dreadful act. There was silence. The clock ticked. The kettle hummed faintly. At last, Colonel Blunt muttered, "Damned cunning. Never thought the woman had it in her." Craddock shot him a sharp glance. "This is not a matter for comment, Colonel. It's a matter for justice." He turned to Clara. "You will come with me now." Clara rose unsteadily, her face slack with defeat. As Craddock led her away, Leonard followed, his head bowed. The remaining guests lingered awkwardly. Mrs. Blunt dabbed her eyes, whispering to Miss Marple, "How dreadful, dreadful beyond words. To think it was Clara all along." Julian shook his head, still pale. "She fooled us all. And Venetia, well, she had her faults, but she didn't deserve this. Vanity isn't a crime." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Vanity is not a crime, but envy, resentment, bitterness. Those are poisons as deadly as any belladonna. Venetia's beauty made her careless. Clara's envy made her cruel. Between them lay tragedy." When the others had gone, Craddock returned briefly, his expression softer than usual. "Oh, you thanks, Miss Marple. Without your observation, I'd have sent Elise to trial. She owes your life." Miss Marple smiled, modest and a little sad. "Poor child. She is safe now, I trust. But, Inspector, it is not I who solved this. It was human nature. People reveal themselves, always, in words, in glances, in the way they hold a mirror. One only has to watch closely." Craddock shook her hand gravely. "You see too much, Miss Marple, more than is comfortable." When he had gone, the cottage fell silent again. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft click of needles filling the room. Outside, the evening sun glowed on the roses in her garden. Life went on, as it always did in St. Mary. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Clara Mayhew, on the quiet venom of envy, the bitterness of a life unlit. "Poor soul," she murmured aloud. "So many crimes begin with vanity, and so many end with it too." The summer sunlight returned to Belladonna Close, warm and golden, as though nothing untoward had ever disturbed its neat little houses. Children played again in the lane. Gardeners bent over their roses. The milkman clattered along on his morning. Outwardly, life resumed its old rhythm, but beneath the surface there lingered shadows, faint but enduring. For those who had been present at Mrs. Fenchurch's dinner party, the memory of that night would never wholly fade. Elise, the maid, was released from custody once Clara Mayhew's confession was secured. She left the Close at once, weeping her gratitude, but vowing never to serve in an English household again. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed and declared it for the best. Mrs. Hartnell remarked that she had always known Elise was innocent, though no one recalled her saying so. But Colonel and Mrs. Blunt remained in their house, but with a quieter air. The Colonel no longer boasted of his golf score, and his wife looked older, frilier, as though the strain had taken years. More than once Miss Marple saw her at church, her lips moving fervently in prayer. Julian Ashworth departed abruptly for London, leaving behind whispers that his affairs in the city were in disarray. Whether he would recover or sink altogether was uncertain. He had spoken kindly of Venetia in the aftermath, but his eyes betrayed relief as well as for some men, Miss Marple reflected, admiration and resentment lie close together. As for Leonard Mayhew, he continued his practice, but his manner grew more somber. His patients found him sterner, less inclined to sarcasm. The scandal of his sister's crime weighed heavily. Clara herself awaited trial, and though Leonard visited her, the lines in his face deepened. Miss Marple thought he bore himself with dignity, but she pitied him nevertheless. Families, she knew, could wound more deeply than any stranger. In St. Mary Mead, gossip eventually settled, as gossip always does. The fete was held, the curate continued to be late, and the roses bloomed as though death had never brushed their petals. Yet the story of Belladonna Close would be told for many years to come, embroidered with each telling. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her ordinary life. She tended her garden, read her improving books, and knitted baby clothes for the vicar. But in her quiet heart, she reflected often upon the tragedy. She thought of Venetia Fenchurch, beautiful, laughing, careless, a woman who sought admiration, who lived upon her reflection. She thought, too, of Clara Mayhew, plain, embittered, overshadowed, a woman who despised what she envied, whose bitterness festered until it blossomed in murder. Vanity, Miss Marple mused one evening as she trimmed her roses, is a dangerous flower. It blooms fair, but its root is poison. One must not plant it too near the heart. Dolly Bantry, coming up the path at that moment, overheard her and, "Jane, you are positively philosophic, but it's true, isn't it? Venetia's vanity killed her, and Clara's vanity destroyed her. Terrible, but oh, what a story it makes." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Human nature, Dolly. That is all. One sees it in villages, in cities, in cottages, and in clothes. People are much the same everywhere. They envy, they resent, they desire. Sometimes, alas." Mrs. Bantry shivered, though the evening was. "And you, Jane, see it all while the rest of us chatter over our tea. You always see what lies beneath." "Perhaps. Miss Marple said modestly. Or perhaps I have only lived long enough to recognize patterns. Each crime, after all, is no more than a variation on the same. One is only to notice the tune. They walked together down the lane, the roses nodding twilight. Belladonna Close lay still, its windows gleaming faintly in the setting sun. To a stranger, it would have seemed the picture of English tranquility. But to those who had lived through its recent shadow, the name carried a sting. Belladonna, beautiful to look upon, deadly at the